Political Intrigue of the Galactic Senate, a Galaxy of Representatives. Chapter 1. The Birth of Galactic Representation. In the earliest epochs of galactic civilization, before the familiar banners of the Republic were hoisted above the skyline of Coruscant, the galaxy was a fractured mosaic of planetary governments, independent star systems, and rival coalitions. Each world viewed the stars with suspicion and promise, their ambitions reaching outward while their fears clutched inward. The core worlds, Alderaan, Coruscant, Corellia, Chandrila, and others, were among the first to embrace spacefaring technology. Their proximity to the galaxy's gravitational heart, both metaphorical and literal, allowed them to dominate early astrographical navigation and interstellar commerce. Yet even as they advanced, their relationships were marred by distrust, conquest, and cold diplomacy. The galaxy needed a solution, a framework through which disparate cultures and economies could coexist without perpetual war. The spark of cooperation came not from benevolence but necessity. During what would come to be known as the pre-Republic unification era, the core worlds teetered on the brink of mutual annihilation. A series of skirmishes, known in later history as the core space border disputes, brought Chandrila and Corellia to arms over a hyperspace beacon array. Coruscant, then still ruled by the Council of Ancient Houses, found itself in the center of diplomatic chaos. It was in this crucible of tension that the first multilateral summit was held in orbit above Alsacan, a neutral world then known for its fierce independence and sophisticated legal systems. Representatives from 34 star systems convened aboard the Unity Spire, a massive orbital station crafted by the Corellians specifically for negotiation. It was here that the first draft of a galactic cooperative charter was outlined, planting the ideological seeds that would one day bloom into the Galactic Senate. The true shift from regional alliances to galactic unity came with the establishment of the Galactic Constitution. Unlike many documents crafted in the shadows of war, the Constitution was an aspirational charter. Its framers envisioned a civilization where disputes could be resolved not through might, but through debate and consensus. Queen Rana Mas Trehalt of Alderaan was a key figure in the document's refinement. A sovereign renowned for her progressive ideals and mastery of interstellar law, she argued passionately for proportional representation and the inclusion of disenfranchised worlds, even those beyond the core. Her influence shaped the central tenets of equal planetary sovereignty, non-aggression, and economic fairness. Another pillar of early Republic governance was Tarsus Valorum, a descendant of the Valorum dynasty that would later produce chancellors. As Speaker of the Core Council, Tarsus advocated for central governance from Coruscant, proposing that it serve not as a capital in the imperial sense, but as a neutral galactic forum. His vision placed the seat of the Senate on the planet's ecumenopolis surface, high above the squabbles of planetary governments, where representatives could speak not only for their homeworlds, but for the interconnected fate of the stars. Alongside him stood the oligarchs of the core, wealthy dynasties and mercantile guilds whose cooperation was bought not with morality, but with legal protections and vast economic incentives enshrined in the Constitution. They allowed the dream to become reality, but in doing so ensured that power would always tilt toward the privileged centers of the galaxy. The Senate Charter, ratified 50 years after the Unification Accords, laid the framework for what would become the Galactic Republic's legislative branch. It defined membership, voting procedures, committee structures, and a rotating chancellorship to be elected by the full Senate body. It also enshrined the controversial practice of granting votes not only to planets but to recognized trade guilds and economic consortia. This policy would later prove catastrophic, but at the time it was heralded as a forward-thinking recognition of the galaxy's interconnected economy. The Charter also established the role of sector governors, appointed intermediaries who would liaise between the Senate and their regional delegations. While theoretically meant to ensure equal distribution of senatorial influence, in practice this gave core-backed governors sweeping influence over rim worlds unaccustomed to centralized authority. In its earliest days, the Senate was composed of just over 100 representatives, drawn primarily from the core and the inner rim. These representatives, known simply as delegates, carried with them the full voting rights of their systems and held the power to propose motions, enact trade regulations, and issue collective decrees of diplomacy or censure. Initially, there was no supreme chancellor. The Senate functioned more like a council of equals, led by a rotating speaker of the session. However, as the Republic grew and diplomatic complexity increased, it became evident that a central figure was required to arbitrate and speak on behalf of the entire Senate body. The creation of the Chancellor's office would follow, though not without significant resistance from several founding worlds, including Alsakin and Raltier. To organize galactic representation efficiently, the Senate divided the galaxy into administrative regions known as sectors and oversectors. Each sector encompassed dozens, sometimes hundreds, of star systems, with one planetary seat assigned the responsibility of sending a representative to the Senate. These senators were tasked with advocating for the needs of not only their own world, but for the entire sector. The method was imperfect. Wealthy or militarily dominant worlds often dominated their regions, silencing poorer or less connected systems, but it allowed for a manageable structure within a rapidly growing republic. Over time, sectors were bundled into larger regional blocks, such as the Core Bloc, the Expansion Region Coalition, the Mid-Rim Delegation, and the often overlooked Outer Rim Territories Assembly. Each bloc developed its own political identity, with unofficial caucuses and alliances forming along cultural, economic, and ideological lines. At the heart of this vast machinery stood the Senate Rotunda on Coruscant, an architectural marvel suspended over the clouds of the city planet. The Rotunda was both a practical venue and a symbolic structure. Its cavernous interior, capable of accommodating over 2,000 floating repulsor podiums, served as the stage upon which the galaxy's future was debated. The chamber was ringed by tiers of observation balconies, media alcoves, and bureaucratic conduits leading to a labyrinthine support infrastructure unseen by the public. From above, the Rotunda appeared as a massive disk embedded into the planetary skyline, its design inspired by the ancient ring temples of Chandrila, an homage to unity and the endless cycle of governance. The central podium, where the Chancellor presided, rose like an obelisk amidst the sea of floating platforms, symbolizing both command and isolation. The symbolism embedded into the Rotunda's architecture was deliberate. Every line, every column, every light fixture was designed to remind those within of the weight of their duty. The chamber's acoustics were tailored to carry even the softest voice across its expanse, a nod to the principle that every representative, no matter how small their world, could be heard. Holographic projection systems allowed for real-time imagery, galactic maps, and visual evidence to be displayed during debates, while droid scribes and protocol officers moved quietly between platforms, recording proceedings and facilitating diplomatic communication. Over time, as the Republic expanded beyond its original scope, the Rotunda evolved from a hall of deliberation to a battlefield of ideology. The early ideals that shaped its construction, the belief in mutual prosperity, the pursuit of peace through debate, were slowly buried beneath waves of corruption, manipulation, and bureaucratic decay. Yet even in its later dysfunction, the Senate retained a mystique. To many across the galaxy, especially those in the Outer Rim or newly admitted systems, the image of the Rotunda remained a beacon of potential, a place where their voices might one day be heard, where justice might be done not by blaster, but by consensus. The birth of galactic representation was a monumental leap forward for civilization. It was not perfect. It was born out of political necessity and economic strategy more than altruism. Yet it represented the first serious attempt to forge unity from diversity on a galactic scale. Through bloodless compromise and occasional bloodshed, through the ambition of queens and oligarchs, through the structure of blocks and the pageantry of architecture, the Galactic Senate emerged as a central force in the destiny of the stars. Its legacy, shaped in marble and metal above the skyline of Coruscant, would echo across millennia, even as its own ideals slowly unraveled. Chapter 2: A Voice for the Stars. To understand the Galactic Senate as an institution is only half the equation. The true power of the Senate resided in its individuals, the senators themselves. These delegates, robed in dignity and girded in layers of ceremonial tradition and political cunning, served not merely as figureheads, but as the mouthpieces, maneuverers, and manipulators of galactic policy. The mechanics of how one became a senator varied wildly across systems, from rigorous elections on core worlds to lifelong autocratic appointments from feudal Outer Rim monarchies. This disparity in political origin often shaped not only the behavior of senators, but their entire approach to governance. On planets like Chandrila, senators were chosen through open planetary elections held every 5 years, marked by impassioned debates, hollow broadcast campaigns, and planetary referendums. Such senators prided themselves on accountability and transparency, at least in theory, and were expected to report back to their constituents regularly. In stark contrast, the noble houses of Sereno, or the technocratic guilds of the Techno-Union, operated under hereditary or appointment-based systems, where senators were assigned by internal councils or ruling families, and often treated their position as a birthright rather than a public service. Once seated, senators enjoyed sweeping legal protections, codified in the Senate Charter under the Galactic Delegate Privilege Act. These protections, known collectively as senatorial immunity, shielded them from arrest, legal prosecution, or search without approval from a two-thirds vote of the full Senate. This clause, originally intended to protect delegates from intimidation or corruption by planetary governments, became a shield for far more nefarious actions. Senators could engage in backroom dealings, accept illicit donations, or maintain unsanctioned off-world assets with near impunity, provided they did not flaunt their misconduct. In addition to legal protections, senators were accorded lavish privileges. Each held an official suite within the Senate district on Coruscant, including private residences, staff quarters, and communications centers. They traveled in diplomatic starships equipped with transponder codes that granted them priority clearance at spaceports and safe passage, even through hostile or embargoed zones. Their diplomatic status extended beyond borders, ensuring that few doors remained closed to them in both the political and criminal spheres. But behind every senator was a machine of influence and survival, an invisible network of aides, strategists, legal counselors, and career bureaucrats who navigated the labyrinthine reality of galactic law and legislative procedure. Most senators retained a personal staff ranging from 5 to 50 individuals, depending on the wealth and prominence of their home system. These aides handled the details of committee work, negotiated with lobbying firms, coordinated press briefings, and maintained critical lines of communication back to their planetary governments. Chief aides, sometimes referred to as senator shadows, were often the true architects of policy, drafting motions, coordinating voting coalitions, and shaping the agendas of their superiors. Their knowledge of procedure, precedent, and subtle back-channel etiquette often meant the difference between legislative triumph and humiliation. In many ways, a skilled aide was more dangerous than a seasoned senator. They operated without visibility, but wielded influence in every conversation, every vote, every diplomatic negotiation. Layered atop this administrative infrastructure were the lobbyists, professional influencers who represented corporate interests, sector-based guilds, regional coalitions, or ideological movements. Their work, though technically regulated, often blurred the line between persuasion and corruption. Companies like Sorosub and Quat Drive Yards retained full-time lobbying arms within Coruscant, offering senators exclusive contracts, sponsored junkets to luxury colonies, or discreet campaign funding funneled through third-party fronts. Lobbyists wielded dossiers of information, both public and private, on every sitting member, including voting records, political affiliations, and vulnerabilities. In public, they framed themselves as partners in progress. In private, they were power brokers who could make or break a senator's career. The Senate was filled with notable personalities, many of whom shaped the course of galactic history from the shadows of the chamber rather than from the spotlight. Bana Brimu, representing the devastated world of Humberine, was known not only for her tragic homeworld's destruction during the Clone Wars, but also for her fierce opposition to the consolidation of emergency powers. Brimu, though often marginalized by the core factions, delivered scathing speeches that pierced the hollow justifications of the military-industrial lobby. Her loyalty to principle, even when faced with the unstoppable tide of Palpatine's rise, earned her quiet admiration among the resistance that would one day follow. Lexi Dio of Yutter, a brilliant orator and legal scholar, rose to fame after her aggressive stance against the expansion of Senate security forces. She championed civil rights and limitations on government surveillance, foreseeing with eerie clarity the erosion of privacy and liberty in the name of security. Though her voice was drowned out by the drums of war, her legislative proposals would later form the basis for the new Republic's civil protection framework. Anaconda Farr, the rotund Radian from Radia, stood as a paradox, an affable, well-intentioned senator who believed fervently in the Republic, yet was manipulated into supporting legislation that undermined its foundation. His later realization and attempts at reconciliation marked one of the most human and tragic arcs within the Senate, demonstrating that sincerity could be both a strength and a fatal flaw. Much of the Senate's work occurred not in dramatic chamber-wide votes, but within its intricate committee system. These committees, modeled after early planetary parliaments, focused on specific domains of governance: trade regulation, defense oversight, intelligence and security, interplanetary law, and more. Committee assignments were coveted, as they offered senators direct control over funding, policy direction, and oversight power. The Trade Regulation Committee, often chaired by representatives from commercial powerhouses like Ariadu or Nimodia, held enormous sway over tariffs, embargoes, and the designation of free trade zones. It was this committee that determined whether a star system's goods would be taxed at favorable rates or subjected to punitive duties, a power that could raise a world into prosperity or plunge it into economic ruin. The Defense Oversight Committee managed fleet deployments, military base construction, and clone production approvals. During the Clone Wars, its influence expanded exponentially, leading some to call it the Senate within the Senate. Meanwhile, the Intelligence Committee handled classified operations, Jedi Order oversight, and the sensitive appointment of intelligence liaisons. Though nominally transparent, much of its business was conducted in closed sessions, where senators exchanged secrets beneath the veil of national security. Committee leadership rotated, but unofficially, seniority and political alliances dictated the outcome. RIM delegates were often excluded, while core representatives with corporate sponsorship maintained permanent seats. Yet the true axis upon which Senate influence turned was prestige, the intangible yet inescapable divide between the core and the RIM. Core senators, hailing from centuries-old civilizations with interstellar universities, ancient navies, and sprawling economic networks, commanded deference and visibility. Their offices were positioned close to the Chancellor's wing. Their words were quoted in the HoloNet. Their political parties controlled legislative calendars. RIM senators, by contrast, were often perceived as rustic, naive, or volatile. Even capable RIM senators, like Orn Free Taa of Ryloth, had to fight uphill battles against entrenched core blocs to have their voices heard. This systemic bias was embedded not only in procedure, but in perception. Core senators dined at exclusive salons, attended galas hosted by Alderaanian nobility, and maintained discreet alliances with influential families. RIM senators struggled to secure even adequate funding for their security escorts or timely transmission privileges from their home systems. They were often targeted for manipulation, recruited into blocs they did not understand, and, if too troublesome, silenced through procedural sabotage. The cultural gap between core and RIM representatives created a distorted version of democracy. While all senators were ostensibly equal in the chamber, power was determined not by vote count, but by network, lineage, and wealth. A senator from Brental 4 could secure 10 allies with a word to the Trade Cartel Guild. A senator from Lothal might struggle to even get a motion introduced. This imbalance bred resentment and ultimately laid the seeds for secessionist sentiment. Many in the Outer Rim viewed the Senate as a gilded theater, a place where core elites debated hypotheticals while their own worlds suffered under pirate raids, economic stagnation, and unchecked corruption. Attempts at reform, such as proportional vote weighting, rotating committee leadership, and independent funding for RIM blocs, were routinely defeated or buried in bureaucracy. It was in this environment that the Confederacy of Independent Systems found fertile ground for its rhetoric, promising local control and an end to Coruscant's indifference. Yet, despite its flaws, the Senate remained a place where ideals occasionally flickered through the haze of power politics. It was a place where the downtrodden could, at times, be heard, where the skilled could rise, and where the future of the galaxy was debated not in silence, but with the booming voices of 1,000 worlds. The senators, for all their divisions, were the embodiment of the Republic's contradictions, part democracy, part oligarchy, part theater, and part battlefield. They carried with them the dreams and ambitions of trillions, cloaked in robes of authority, walking the marbled halls of a government forever teetering between idealism and collapse. Chapter 3: The Machinery of Democracy. From a distance, the Galactic Senate presented itself as the apex of order, an immense and hallowed hall where decorum reigned and the collective wisdom of thousands of systems was translated into galactic law. Yet, behind the ceremonial robes, polished repulsor podiums, and lofty rhetoric, the Senate functioned more like a vast and tangled machine, humming with the competing engines of bureaucracy, ideology, personal ambition, and hidden influence. Its procedures, refined over centuries, were as much about controlling the flow of power as they were about ensuring representation. The daily rhythm of Senate life began not in the Great Rotunda, but in a multitude of administrative wings, each containing floor after floor of legislative chambers, committee rooms, briefing theaters, and data archives. Senators seldom wrote their own proposals. Those were drafted by staffers, reviewed by aides, scrutinized by lawyers, and modified by subcommittees before ever seeing the floor. A bill could be proposed formally during a general session, but more often, it began its life as a motion submitted to one of the standing committees. If it survived the scrutiny, it would return to the General Assembly for debate, potential amendment, and eventually a vote. Amendments were common and often used as weapons, carefully inserted clauses to delay, derail, or poison otherwise popular legislation. Vetoes were the nuclear option. While the Senate as a body could override its own previous decisions with a supermajority, certain high-ranking officials, particularly the Supreme Chancellor, possessed the ability to issue direct vetoes on bills deemed harmful to galactic security or financial stability. Though limited in scope by the Constitution, these powers were often interpreted loosely and, in times of crisis, invoked with alarming frequency. The veto process itself became a form of theater. A chancellor would often signal their disapproval through back channels, giving senators time to withdraw or reword their proposals in order to save political face. When a veto was publicly delivered, it came with carefully orchestrated statements and was accompanied by synchronized messaging campaigns through the Republic HoloNet to justify the act to the broader populace. Over time, veto threats became a political currency. Chancellors would trade their willingness to withhold a veto in exchange for support on unrelated matters, ensuring the office remained a hub of both diplomacy and coercion. The Supreme Chancellor's role, enshrined by the Senate Charter as both an executive leader and a servant of the legislative body, was originally designed to be more ceremonial than commanding. The Chancellor presided over sessions, managed procedural order, and represented the Senate in foreign affairs. But as the galaxy expanded and threats both real and manufactured increased, the power of the Chancellor grew proportionately. During the Clone Wars, that power accelerated dangerously, culminating in the granting of emergency powers to Chancellor Palpatine, a precedent that shattered the carefully balanced duality of Republic governance. In practice, the Chancellor's office evolved into a semi-autonomous government within the government, issuing directives, fast-tracking legislation, and even bypassing Senate votes by invoking constitutional loopholes. Emergency provisions, initially written to deal with natural disasters or localized insurrections, were expanded in language and scope to cover broad security threats, allowing for executive action without debate. These constitutional bypasses became the favored tools of ambitious leaders, granting the illusion of legality to decisions made without consultation or consensus. Beneath the Senate's visible structure sprawled an even larger and more labyrinthine apparatus, the bureaucracies. Among these, the Ministry of Finance loomed largest. Tasked with managing Republic credits, system subsidies, trade tariffs, and interstellar loans, the ministry was the quiet backbone of galactic economics. Controlled by senior technocrats appointed by the Chancellor but confirmed by Senate committees, the ministry operated largely independently, issuing reports, allocating funds, and quietly directing economic policy through incentives and penalties. Senators who knew how to work the ministry's networks could ensure their sectors received increased trade development funds or military construction contracts, while opponents found their budgets mysteriously slashed. Closely tied to the ministry was the judicial circuit, an intricate web of regional courts, legal codices, and mobile arbitration panels that enforced Senate rulings and mediated interplanetary disputes. Though theoretically impartial, the circuit was not immune to political manipulation. Judges owed their positions to Senate confirmation, and ambitious senators would often pressure the Judiciary Selection Committee to appoint jurists sympathetic to their own faction's causes. The passage of legislation, in theory a noble process of democratic deliberation, in practice functioned like a high-stakes game of influence and manipulation. Bribery, though illegal, was rampant, operating under layers of plausible deniability. Direct credits rarely changed hands. Instead, favors were traded in the form of political endorsements, business opportunities, or access to restricted data. A senator might vote in favor of a shipbuilding bill that benefited a rival sector in exchange for a promise to support their appointment to a key committee. Lobbyists, operating in concert with corporate backers, would provide talking points, sponsor research, and even ghostwrite entire bills, feeding them through sympathetic senators who would pass them off as original initiatives. It was not uncommon for a single motion to have been touched by dozens of entities, each with a hand in shaping its final form. Coercion also played its part. Threats of exposure, withholding of funds, or even retaliation by political enforcers kept more idealistic senators in check. Many learned quickly that to oppose the machine was to be crushed by it, either through procedural marginalization or outright scandal. And then there were the unseen players, the shadows that moved behind the drapes of democracy. Chief among them was the Black Sun Syndicate, a vast criminal enterprise that had embedded itself within the Republic's institutions through bribery, extortion, and the silent complicity of ambitious officials. While the Senate publicly condemned organized crime, several investigations quietly died in committee, buried beneath mountains of procedural obstruction. Black Sun operated through front companies and lobbying firms, laundering its influence through layers of intermediaries. It provided campaign financing to vulnerable senators, arranged discreet retirements of whistleblowers, and maintained a network of informants within the bureaucracy. The criminal organization thrived in chaos, and it leveraged the Senate's constant churn of crisis in response to expand its foothold, offering security solutions to lawless sectors and corrupting customs authorities to facilitate illicit trade routes. Equally insidious was the corporate sector authority. Originally established as a semi-autonomous zone to encourage private development beyond the mid-rim, the authority quickly evolved into a corporatocracy that governed itself with minimal Senate oversight. Its member corporations amassed fortunes unchecked by regulation and used their influence to push legislation favorable to deregulation, privatization, and increased military protection of their assets. The corporate sector's delegates in the Senate, technically advisors without full voting rights, nonetheless wielded disproportionate power, often shepherding bills through sympathetic core world senators whose campaigns they funded. The authority's wealth was so immense that entire voting blocks could be influenced through infrastructure loans or trade incentives. Critics called the Senate's relationship with the authority a parasitic codependency. Idealists called it treason. Over time, the machinery of democracy in the Galactic Senate became self-sustaining. It was no longer a mechanism to reflect the will of the people or safeguard peace, but a system designed to perpetuate its own authority. Senators came and went, but the procedures remained. Committees continued to meet, motions continued to pass, budgets continued to be allocated, all functioning like the ticking of a great chronometer, precise and indifferent. For the average citizen, the Senate was distant, incomprehensible, and irrelevant. For the powerful, it was a tool, finely honed and dangerously sharp. And for those who lived within its walls, it was a living creature, one with many mouths, many stomachs, and no heart. Despite its flaws, or perhaps because of them, the Senate endured. Its inertia was too great, its architecture too deeply embedded in the bones of the Republic. Reform efforts rose and fell like waves against the durasteel cliffs of tradition. Even in its most dysfunctional moments, the Senate remained the stage upon which the grand dramas of the galaxy played out, dramas that would one day collapse into civil war. But while the chamber still echoed with speeches and votes, while the bureaucracy still hummed and the chancellor still ruled from the central podium, the machinery of democracy turned on, grinding away behind velvet curtains, never stopping, never sleeping, always hungry. Chapter 4: Lines of Power. Trade was the true blood of the Galactic Republic, and hyperspace lanes were its arteries. Far from being simple corridors of travel, these lanes defined the lifeblood of entire economies, determined the rise and fall of planetary powers, and dictated the Republic's most strategic decisions. The galaxy, vast and seemingly infinite, was rendered manageable only through the manipulation of hyperspace. Its navigable corridors of stability were rare, dangerous to chart, and fiercely protected. At the center of this web were the great trade routes, ancient and essential: the Hydian Way, Prolemian Trade Route, Corellian Run, and Rima Trade Route. These were more than navigational paths. They were instruments of control, each route feeding the core worlds with a steady stream of wealth, influence, and dependency. Their existence bound distant outer rim systems to the political will of Coruscant, whether those systems understood it or not. In theory, these routes were protected assets of the Republic, governed by mutual benefit and interstellar cooperation. In practice, they were political weapons, used to reward allies, punish dissenters, and maintain a galactic hierarchy dominated by the core and its corporate allies. The Hydian Way was the most expansive, stretching from the outer rim all the way to the deep core. It allowed bulk transport of industrial materials, food, and armaments at a speed and volume unmatched by any other route. Its control gave rise to major commercial hubs like Ariadu and Sluis Van, and became the backbone of supply during the Clone Wars. Whoever dominated the Hydian Way held the power to economically strangle or empower entire sectors. It was no coincidence that Senator Ascok of Malastare, whose planet sat along the Hydian's midsection, wielded disproportionate influence in trade regulation hearings. The Perlemian trade route, meanwhile, connected the inner core to the northern outer rim, serving as a critical diplomatic corridor during the early days of the Republic. The route's access to scholarly worlds like Ossus and Brental IV made it a favored path for cultural and diplomatic exchange, and its security was often prioritized in Senate budget debates, not because of humanitarian concerns, but because so many core delegates had vested interests along its length. The Corellian Run, an ancient route charted by Corellian explorers and maintained by their powerful merchant navy, provided a crucial eastward artery linking Coruscant to rim worlds like Ryloth and Tatooine. Its legacy of independence shaped Corellian politics for generations, and the planet's senators were often vocal defenders of local autonomy and trade deregulation. The Rima trade route, less elegant but no less important, served as the Republic's lifeline into the far southern reaches. Its passage through lawless systems and uncharted territories made it vulnerable, but also lucrative. Smugglers, mercenaries, and independent haulers thrived along its length, often under unofficial protection from Republic-licensed mercantile guilds who paid quiet bribes to ensure no Senate resolution interfered with their security contracts. These four routes formed the great constellation of galactic commerce, and the Senate's most powerful blocks were shaped entirely by their access to and control of them. Control of a trade route was tantamount to regional dominance. Systems that intersected these lanes became staging points for industry, taxation hubs, or protected monopolies. Senators from such worlds were not simply representatives, they were kingmakers. Votes were traded for shipping guarantees. Political favors were exchanged for starport expansions. The core bloc dominated early trade regulation, having secured their positions through generations of route-centric legislation. The mid-rim, ever hungry for recognition, was often forced to align with core delegates to gain access to infrastructure funds. Outer rim worlds, lacking direct hyperspace connectivity, were treated as little more than markets, sources of raw goods and labor, but rarely the subjects of serious economic policy. This imbalance was not incidental. It was manufactured and enforced through Senate committees that could impose trade restrictions, delay shipping route expansions, or manipulate docking tariffs under the guise of interstellar safety. The rise of the Trade Federation marked a turning point in this delicate balance. Originally a commercial guild focused on resource transportation and starship logistics, the Federation leveraged its strategic contracts into a quasi-governmental role. Granted full Senate representation under the flawed corporate sovereignty compromise, the Trade Federation became both a participant and an enforcer of Republic commerce. Its fleets patrolled shipping lanes, enforced embargoes, and brokered access through disputed sectors. With its own senator seated in the rotunda, it lobbied aggressively for deregulation, anti-piracy exemptions, and protective legislation that solidified its monopoly. The Federation's influence was not subtle. Its viceroys hosted opulent diplomatic events on Neimoidia and Cato Neimoidia, inviting senators, bureaucrats, and judicial officials to discuss economic efficiency. In exchange, entire star systems found themselves beholden to the Federation's terms. Routes diverted, fees increased, and non-compliant governments subjected to trade lockdowns that crippled local economies. This strategy, political extortion through logistics, was not universally condemned. Many senators viewed it as an efficient solution to the Republic's chaotic border regions. Others were simply bought. The Federation's rise became a warning that corporate power, when mixed with political legitimacy, could override the will of democratically elected delegates. Even when the blockade of Naboo shocked the galaxy, the Senate's initial response was paralyzed by procedural obfuscation and vested interests. Petitions were lost in committee, investigations were stalled, and proposed sanctions against the Federation were defeated by a coalition of trade-aligned senators who feared the loss of their own shipping privileges. The very institution that claimed to safeguard galactic peace had become dependent on the logistical infrastructure of its most powerful corporate member. Beneath this growing tension emerged two broad ideological factions within the Senate: the expansionist bloc and the isolationists. The expansionists, composed largely of core and inner rim delegates, believed the Republic's future lay in economic centralization and the consolidation of hyperspace infrastructure. They championed the establishment of permanent way stations, enforced trade corridors, and diplomatic compacts that would allow the Republic to oversee even the most distant shipping routes. Their proposals included standardized navigation taxes, the creation of Republic-managed trade security forces, and the integration of independent shipping guilds into a single, regulated body. The isolationists, a diverse coalition of mid-rim idealists, outer-rim populists, and core libertarians, rejected this vision. They argued for the protection of local trade rights, criticized the increasing power of corporations, and demanded the repeal of policies that allowed for punitive embargoes against unaligned systems. Their voices, though passionate, were often drowned out by the expansionist control of trade regulation committees and the financial backing they received from commercial interests. This divide played out in countless legislative battles. Expansionist senators would propose lucrative contracts for new hyperspace hubs or security patrols. Isolationists would respond with counterbills demanding budget transparency and an end to what they labeled economic colonization. But the real damage was done not in open debate, but in the manipulation of embargoes and tariffs. The Senate held the power to declare system-wide embargoes under Article 94 of the Galactic Constitution, a clause intended to protect against hostile regimes or violations of interstellar law. In practice, it became a tool of power projection. Planets that refused to adhere to Republic trade standards or that aligned with separatist factions found themselves blacklisted, their exports blocked, their import taxes quadrupled. The justification was always cloaked in language of safety or ethics, stability concerns, hazardous goods, lack of regulatory compliance. In reality, they were messages: comply or be crushed. Tariff manipulation was equally effective. The Senate could, through a simple vote, adjust the import fees of entire sectors. Worlds dependent on single industries, like agricultural worlds in the Rayo Balo sector or mining colonies in the Tupani sector, could be devastated overnight by a shift in tariff rates. Such moves were rarely made publicly. They were buried in omnibus bills, hidden behind technocratic language, or delegated to subcommittees whose meetings were closed to the public. Senators learned to trade tariff adjustments like currency. A vote on a defense budget might hinge not on its contents, but on a quiet agreement to reduce import taxes on a colleague's homeworld in exchange for support. These deals were rarely recorded, but their fingerprints stained every budget, every regulation, every interstellar agreement. The result was a system where trade, and by extension survival, was political. Systems that aligned themselves with the dominant blocs received new trade stations, favorable shipping lanes, and subsidies for port expansion. Systems that resisted were allowed to wither. This strategy kept the Republic cohesive, but only through coercion. It bred resentment in the mid and outer rims, fed the rhetoric of separatist movements, and gave rise to countless smuggling cartels and black markets that filled the gaps left by official neglect. In many ways, the Republic's trade policies shaped the galaxy more profoundly than its military interventions. Wars were expensive and unpopular. Tariffs and embargoes were quiet, efficient, and deniable. The manipulation of trade routes by the Senate revealed the raw mechanics of its power. Behind every speech about unity or prosperity lay a web of economic pressure points, each one tied to a hyperspace lane, a starport, a refueling station. Senators did not need armies to control the stars. They needed votes, committee seats, and allies in the right corridors of power. They understood that commerce dictated allegiance. Control the lanes, and you control the fate of worlds. And so, in the shadows of the Senate rotunda, beneath the marble and light, deals were struck not for the good of the galaxy, but for the control of its pulse. Chapter 5: Voices from the Rim. For all its proclamations of unity, progress, and justice, the Galactic Senate was a body that served the core first and the galaxy second. Nowhere was this more evident than in the outer rim territories, a vast expanse of stars, worlds, and cultures marginalized by a system that lauded representation but practiced hierarchy. While the core worlds basked in the glow of prosperity, trade, and security, the outer rim simmered beneath layers of neglect, exploitation, and enforced dependency. The Senate chambers echoed with the voices of Coruscant, Alderaan, Chandrila, and Corellia, civilizations that had long since mastered the art of influence. But the whispers of places like Ryloth, Cernpittal, and Malastair were filtered, if not silenced, by the mechanisms of bureaucracy. The inequities were not incidental. They were the outcome of structural decisions that placed power, resources, and visibility in the hands of those already within the inner ring of galactic civilization. The Outer Rim, ever on the edge of Senate maps and funding charts, was included in word but excluded in truth. Cernpittal was a haunting example, a world remembered mostly for its tragedy during the Yuuzhan Vong invasion, but its decline had begun long before. A minor agricultural and orbital trade hub in the Mid-Rim, Cernpittal had petitioned the Senate for decades for trade protections and defense funding, citing increasing pirate raids and holonet disruptions that were crippling its planetary economy. Its senator, a low-profile appointee with limited committee access, was repeatedly stonewalled. When the planet's orbiting moon Dornick 319 was pulled from the sky, resulting in catastrophic planetary destruction, the Republic's response was sluggish and apathetic. Relief ships arrived late, survivors were relocated to already overburdened mid-rim colonies, and the event was buried beneath larger headlines concerning economic negotiations in the core. For the Outer Rim, Cernpittal became a chilling reminder that their lives were secondary, that their pain was procedural. Ryloth's story was different, but no less damning. A rich world of cultural complexity and mineral wealth, Ryloth's location deep in the Outer Rim made it a convenient subject of both exploitation and political tokenism. While its Twi'lek people maintained a proud tradition of resistance and self-rule, their interactions with the Senate were dominated by a long line of pet senators, representatives approved or outright installed by off-world trade guilds or puppet regimes. These senators, while nominally speaking for Ryloth, served primarily to maintain stability, approve corporate mining contracts, and suppress calls for sovereignty. Their appointments were justified by claims of protecting economic partnerships or ensuring regional security. But the effect was to neuter local agency. Twi'lek resistance leaders appealed again and again to Senate oversight bodies for audits, reforms, or elections. Their petitions disappeared into subcommittees, and their protests were labeled separatist or destabilizing. Ryloth, rich in resources and dignity, was treated as a frontier outpost whose fate was to be managed, not respected. Malastair, though better integrated into the Republic economy, suffered from a different breed of inequity. The planet was critical in supplying fuel derivatives, especially Podracer-grade Andoan oil, and yet its native Dug population saw little benefit. While its grand colonists wielded senatorial power and corporate influence, Dugs were relegated to service and industrial roles, with limited access to political power or legal advocacy. The Senate, when questioned about this imbalance, waved it off as an internal planetary matter, citing the Republic's respect for member autonomy. But behind the excuse lay the real problem. The Senate did not want to intervene in a system that worked for its donors. The Grand Senators secured vital fuel exports at favorable tariffs and voted reliably with core trade blocs. Their loyalty ensured that any efforts to investigate systemic inequality were drowned in layers of procedural deflection. On paper, Malastair was a success story, profitable, secure, and productive. In reality, it was a microcosm of the broader injustice built into the Republic's structure. Such injustice was not only tolerated, but perpetuated through the practice of senatorial manipulation. In the more isolated systems, it became common for the Senate or its proxies to install so-called pet senators, delegates with little local support or legitimacy, but with strong ties to core factions or corporate sponsors. These senators functioned as political puppets, casting votes as instructed, signing off on exploitative contracts, and presenting a facade of representation. Some were local collaborators, others were imported bureaucrats assigned with the promise of wealth and status. Their loyalty was to the hand that fed them, not to the people they claimed to serve. Dissenting voices from their homeworlds were dismissed as radicals or terrorists. Protests were met with Republic peacekeeper deployments. The process gave the illusion of democracy while entrenching autocracy, a slow erosion of planetary sovereignty carried out under the Senate's approving gaze. Even when true representatives emerged from these marginalized systems, they faced a battlefield of obstruction. The practice of galactic gerrymandering, a term borrowed from ancient core world political traditions, allowed for the manipulation of sector boundaries and representative blocks. Systems were redrawn not based on geography or population, but on political expediency. The Bodhan HoloNet scandal laid bare the depth of this corruption. Bothawi, home to one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in the galaxy, leaked internal Senate data revealing that voting districts in the Mid-Rim had been systematically redrawn to dilute the influence of reformist worlds. Star systems with aligned political views were split between different blocks, ensuring that their collective votes never reached a critical threshold. Planets with rising independence movements were clustered with wealthier, pro-core neighbors, allowing those neighbors to override their votes in block sessions. The Senate's official response was denial, followed by silence. The committee tasked with investigating the scandal quietly dissolved 2 cycles later, citing budgetary constraints. As these injustices accumulated, so too did resistance. Long before the formal birth of the Rebel Alliance, the Mid-Rim became a crucible of discontent. Small coalitions of planetary governors, trade unions, and civic leaders began to coordinate outside the traditional Senate apparatus. These governors' leagues, often informal at first, shared intelligence, pooled resources, and began organizing diplomatic missions not through Coruscant, but through back-channel alliances. Worlds like Eshan, Iridonia, and Onderon became centers of cultural pride and political awakening. Underground press networks translated and distributed speeches from dissident senators, while pirate-operated HoloNet channels broadcasted debates censored on official feeds. Peaceful protesters on Elrud, economic strikers on Ord Mantell, and student activists on Anaxes all echoed the same message. The Republic had abandoned its promise. Rebellion was not born in a single moment, nor driven solely by ideology. It was a cumulative response to being ignored, silenced, and sacrificed. This slow-boiling unrest found fuel and focus in the rhetoric of Count Dooku. Once a respected Jedi Master and Senator's son, Dooku had seen the Senate's rot firsthand during his years on Coruscant and in the Outer Rim. Disillusioned with the Republic's failure to address systemic corruption and injustice, he renounced both the Jedi Order and the Senate in dramatic fashion. But it was not his departure that shook the galaxy, it was what followed. Dooku traveled the Mid and Outer Rims, meeting with governors, merchants, and planetary leaders disillusioned with Coruscant's rule. His charisma, erudition, and mastery of oratory made him a formidable figure, one who could translate frustration into purpose. He spoke not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, invoking sovereignty, dignity, and mutual respect. Systems that had long suffered in silence found a voice in his declarations. Senators sympathetic to his message began raising motions, questioning core bloc dominance, calling for constitutional reforms. These voices were quickly isolated, stripped of committee access, and in some cases investigated under the vague umbrella of security threats. Behind Dooku's rise was a growing network of former senators, disillusioned Jedi, and ambitious bureaucrats. The separatist movement did not spring from chaos. It grew in the soil of betrayal, watered by generations of inequality. Its Senate roots were often ignored by official histories, but in truth, many of its earliest leaders had once sat beneath the Rotunda Dome, raising their hands in vain. The movement's message resonated because it mirrored what countless systems had already known: that the Republic had become an engine of stagnation, that its noble ideals masked a machinery built to serve the powerful. By the time war broke out, the damage had already been done. Systems did not secede in pursuit of conflict, they did so out of despair. The Outer Rim was not a monolith. It contained empires and dust bowls, thriving cities and ancient ruins, but what united its people was a shared memory of being overlooked. In the grand theater of the Galactic Senate, their seats were placed at the edge of the stage, their microphones barely audible, their motions lost in translation. The machinery of the Republic turned with relentless momentum, and those without leverage were ground beneath it. And yet, their voices never truly fell silent. They echoed in protest songs, pirate broadcasts, refugee fleets, and resistance cells. They carried across the stars, unanswered but enduring. In time, they would coalesce into revolution. But long before the first blaster was raised in defiance, there had been voices from the Rim, pleading, warning, resisting, long ignored by the halls of power. Chapter 6: Corporate Seats and Economic Empires. At the heart of the Galactic Senate's transformation from a forum of planetary representation into a battleground of vested interests stood one inescapable truth. The Republic had allowed its legislative body to become the playground of business empires. The fusion of commerce and politics was not a sudden revolution, but a slow entanglement, a centuries-long tightening of invisible cords between trade conglomerates and senators who grew accustomed to wealthier campaigns, stronger alliances, and easier paths to influence. Over time, the distinction between planetary sovereignty and corporate leverage eroded, until it was not planets that wielded power in the rotunda, but markets. The Techno-Union, Commerce Guild, and Intergalactic Banking Clan were not merely economic entities. They became political institutions in their own right, each securing a seat in the Senate and treating lawmaking as a cost center within their strategic operations. What began as a partnership, industry aiding the Republic's growth, ended with industry reshaping the Republic in its image. The Techno-Union, originally a cooperative of manufacturing guilds and research firms, presented itself as an engine of innovation. It built infrastructure across the Outer Rim, provided planetary defense systems to frontier worlds, and offered cybernetic advancement to underdeveloped systems. But beneath the branding lay a powerful syndicate of arms developers and industrial monopolists. Its representative in the Senate, often a rotating figurehead from SCACO or the Union's board of directors, lobbied aggressively for defense subsidies, intellectual property protections, and security exemptions that allowed the Union to maintain private droid armies, technically for planetary protection, but in truth a method of enforcing debt collection and corporate compliance. The Commerce Guild operated similarly, presenting itself as a facilitator of interstellar trade and arbitration, while acting as an enforcer of economic discipline, choking dissenting systems through shipping delays and credit freezes. The banking clan, most insidious of all, extended its influence through debt, offering reconstruction loans to war-torn sectors at favorable terms to ensure legislative compliance in future Senate votes. Each of these entities was granted senatorial status under the Republic's controversial Non-Governmental Sovereignty Amendment, a bill that codified the legal fiction of corporate personhood, allowing business organizations to be treated as independent polities with full rights of representation. This legal sleight of hand became the keystone of corporate power. Under its provisions, conglomerates could lobby for sectoral exemptions, propose legislation, and, most importantly, vote. These votes were often wielded as kingmakers. When critical bills hovered near majority, the corporate delegates would cast deciding ballots in exchange for tax incentives, regulatory waivers, or direct concessions. To justify their status, the corporations argued that they employed millions, maintained public infrastructure, and safeguarded trade routes more efficiently than the Senate itself. Senators who questioned this arrangement were painted as anti-progress, anti-development, or dangerously populist. And yet, the consequences of corporate representation were visible in every corner of the galaxy. Planetary labor laws were watered down or delayed in committee. Environmental regulations that would hinder extraction operations on remote worlds were quietly tabled. Subsidies intended for agrarian development were rerouted to logistics firms under the guise of transport modernization. The Republic's legislative agenda became a spreadsheet of quarterly priorities, each line item a balance of favors and kickbacks. Behind the facade of deliberation were mountains of credits. Corporations funneled campaign donations to sympathetic senators through layers of shell companies and lobbying arms. Senators were invited to fact-finding retreats on luxury moons, where executive boardrooms replaced committee chambers. Voting blocs were formed not through ideology, but through financial networks. A vote against the banking clan's interest could result in frozen accounts, negative credit ratings for a senator's homeworld, or orchestrated stock collapses that triggered public unrest. The Quat Drive Yard scandal laid bare the scale of this manipulation. One of the galaxy's largest starship manufacturers, Quat Drive Yards held lucrative defense contracts with both the Republic Navy and private security firms. When internal documents were leaked showing that KDY had funded 10 separate senatorial campaigns in exchange for exclusive rights to shipyard construction and price protection clauses, a brief investigation was launched. Hearings were convened, witnesses called, and reforms proposed. But by the end of the cycle, no punishments were levied. The senators implicated returned to their committees, and KDY's stock rose 3 points by week's end. The scandal's only lasting effect was a brief increase in campaign finance disclosures, which were quietly scaled back the following term. At the edge of this corporate political fusion stood the Corporate Sector Authority, a semi-autonomous region of space carved out by the Senate itself to promote free enterprise in the galaxy's underdeveloped zones. Originally marketed as a bold experiment in economic liberty, the authority quickly became a fiefdom of conglomerates, ruled by executive directors instead of governors, patrolled by privatized enforcers instead of peacekeepers, and accountable to no electorate. Its charter granted it near-complete independence from the Senate, including the right to maintain its own legal code, taxation system, and security fleet. In theory, the corporate sector remained a republic member. In practice, it was a sovereign plutocracy. Attempts to audit its governance or subject it to Senate oversight were met with fierce resistance. Delegates representing the authority held non-voting advisory seats in the Senate, but exerted enormous influence through economic leverage and information control. Senators who questioned the authority's ethics found themselves stonewalled by procedural motions or targeted by disinformation campaigns orchestrated through corporate-controlled media. As the authority flourished, it became a model for other corporate enclaves. Systems like Eddy IV, Munilinst, and Castell began drafting their own semi-sovereign compacts, hoping to replicate the autonomy and economic windfall the authority enjoyed. This push was not organic. It was fueled by lobbying campaigns, ghost-written legislation, and the promise of infrastructure investment, all orchestrated by a cabal of corporate strategists who saw the Republic not as a government, but as a portfolio. What had once been a body of planetary delegates became a market of influence. Senate sessions turned into press conferences for economic policy. Committee reports were replaced with quarterly earnings projections. Senators who rose through the ranks did so not by mastering diplomacy, but by learning to speak the language of capital, regulatory frameworks, investment incentives, market elasticity. The transformation was gradual but total. The Republic was no longer a democracy in spirit. It had become a plutocracy in function. The most damning evidence of this transformation was not in legislation or scandals, but in the silences. Bills regulating droid rights were never introduced. Proposals for worker protections in mining colonies were perpetually stalled. Calls for transparency in corporate governance were met with procedural delays. The voices of independent senators, planetary activists, and outer rim delegates were drowned in the soundproof walls of wealth. When war finally erupted, and the galaxy plunged into conflict between Republic and Separatist factions, many were surprised by how easily systems fell away from Coruscant's grip. But to those who had watched the Senate transform, it was no surprise at all. The Republic had long since stopped representing its citizens. It had become a monument to commerce, a monument whose foundations were built not on law, but on credit, whose pillars were not values, but margins. And yet, within the great dome of the Senate rotunda, the rituals continued. Senators arrived in polished transports, aides whispered agendas, and the Chancellor rose to address a body that still claimed to speak for the stars. But the chamber had changed. It no longer echoed with the voices of peoples and cultures. It echoed with the weighted silence of purchase orders, legal waivers, and silent transactions. The Galactic Senate, once the flame of representative hope in a divided galaxy, had become something else entirely. A throne room for economic empires, where the price of power was paid not in blood or belief, but in contracts, credits, and corporate compliance. Chapter 7: Shadow Committees and Secret Agendas. Beneath the grand spectacle of senatorial debate, past the sweeping speeches and glowing repulsor podiums of the rotunda, lay a second, hidden Senate, a labyrinthine world of classified subcommittees, encrypted votes, and whispered alliances. It was here, in the depths of the Republic's legislative machine, that the most dangerous and decisive decisions were made. Unseen by the galactic public, unrecorded by the official archives, and often unacknowledged by the very senators who benefited from their outcomes, these clandestine functions of governance revealed the truth behind the Republic's polished veneer. The Galactic Senate was not merely a democratic institution. It was a sprawling intelligence network, a breeding ground for shadow wars, and a palace of secrets where information was a weapon and silence was currency. Of all its inner workings, none wielded more veiled power than the Senate Intelligence Committee, an entity so deeply embedded in secrecy that many senators feared to even speak of its reach. The Senate Intelligence Committee was not an open body. Its membership was handpicked by the Chancellor and the Senate Oversight Council, often based more on political loyalty than competence. Meetings were held in secured chambers deep below the Senate complex, accessible only through biometric authentication and guarded by elite Coruscant Security Bureau detachments. Its stated mandate was the coordination and supervision of interstellar intelligence efforts in the name of galactic stability. In practice, it controlled the funding, scope, and oversight of hundreds of intelligence operations across the Republic's territories, including surveillance networks, agent deployment, and covert psychological operations. It also maintained regulatory oversight of the Jedi Order, nominally to ensure the Knights operated in line with the Republic Charter, but increasingly to track their movements, activities, and loyalties. The Jedi were once trusted protectors of peace, but as the Republic grew wary of any autonomous institution, even they fell under the watchful eye of the Intelligence Committee. Senators on the committee demanded mission briefings, interrogated masters over their actions on disputed worlds, and approved special observation cells that followed Jedi movements on Coruscant and beyond. What began as oversight became suspicion, and what began as suspicion became a quiet campaign of containment. Outside its reach, the Senate also authorized a growing wave of unauthorized surveillance against its own member systems. These operations, technically illegal under Republic law, were often justified using broad clauses in the Emergency Measures Act, vague language about safeguarding galactic integrity that permitted near-limitless interpretations. Entire sectors were wiretapped, planetary holofeeds were scraped for dissident rhetoric, and encrypted communications between governors and local legislatures were intercepted and archived without consent. Some of these programs were managed through proxy departments or outsourced to corporate intelligence firms, allowing the Senate to maintain plausible deniability. In the mid-rim, entire movements for planetary reform were quietly monitored, their leaders tracked, their allies discredited through planted scandals or financial sabotage. In some cases, the mere suspicion of disloyalty led to the freezing of development grants, the removal of sector governors, or the sudden rerouting of trade convoys critical to local economies. Surveillance was no longer about protection. It was about control. Funding for these projects came not from public budgets, but from black allocations, untraceable lines embedded in the Republic's vast financial web. The Coruscant Security Bureau, the de facto enforcement arm of the Senate's secret interests, operated entirely outside of conventional accountability. Ostensibly tasked with planetary security and diplomatic protection, the CSB had long since evolved into an intelligence powerhouse, equipped with its own fleet, informant networks, and interrogation chambers deep beneath the Senate district. It received its budget through a web of classified appropriations, often labeled with innocuous titles like Infrastructure Security Initiative or Emergency Civil Operations. These budgets were unmarked, unitemized, and subject only to the quiet approval of senior committee members. Senators often signed off on these allocations without reading them, trusting aides or fearing retribution. Those who asked too many questions were often visited by policy liaisons who explained, politely but firmly, that it was in the Republic's best interest not to interfere. Beyond formal committees, secret alliances flourished within the Senate like fungi in the dark. Rival blocs, which in public hurled invective across the chamber, would in private meet behind soundproof doors, arranging vote swaps, policy betrayals, and long-term power strategies. These clandestine meetings were often held off-world or in closed wings of Coruscant's elite diplomatic clubs. Entire legislative sessions were rigged in advance, key votes timed to coincide with travel absences, procedural rulings manipulated by cooperative vice-chancellors, and opposition voices drowned in orchestrated outbursts. Senators who broke these backroom pacts found themselves frozen out of committee appointments, their homeworlds forgotten during budget season, their reputations savaged by conveniently timed media leaks. It became increasingly difficult to discern where ideological rivalry ended and theatrical performance began. Senators were no longer representatives of systems. They were pieces on a vast board, moved by unseen hands and scripted narratives. And when a senator could not be controlled, when bribery failed and threats proved insufficient, the machinery resorted to removal. Officially, no senator had ever been assassinated by the Republic, but unofficially the list was long. Disappearances were cloaked in plausible stories, shuttle accidents over uncharted hyperspace lanes, sudden illnesses exacerbated by travel, resignations due to personal scandal. Poisonings were whispered of in the corridors of the North Wing, subtle agents introduced into beverages or inhalants, leaving behind no evidence but a grieving staff. In some cases, retirement was the preferred path, engineered through psychological pressure, economic collapse of the senator's family estate, or discreet reminders of long-buried indiscretions. These soft removals were often effective, ensuring silence and deniability. But in more extreme cases, particularly those involving senators with genuine popular support or independent funding, the mechanisms grew darker. Investigations would be launched under false pretenses, allies arrested on fabricated charges, and public smear campaigns unleashed with brutal precision. The goal was not simply removal, but erasure. The case of Senator Hosel Danne remains the most infamous example. A former academic from Aldregg 6, Danne had risen to prominence as a reformist voice, calling for full audit transparency of the Senate's classified budget allocations. Charismatic, principled, and unafraid of confrontation, he rallied a surprising coalition of core and mid-rim senators around his proposals, gaining momentum through a popular HoloNet series in which he explained fiscal manipulation in terms accessible to the average citizen. His central thesis was damning: that the Senate was siphoning hundreds of millions of credits each cycle into unmarked projects with no oversight, and that these funds were being used not to defend the Republic, but to entrench its ruling elite. His demands for an unmarked budget inquiry were initially blocked in committee. When he threatened to force a chamber-wide vote, media attacks began almost overnight. Danne was accused of romantic entanglements with a foreign spy, corruption in university land deals, and financial improprieties in his youth. Each accusation was baseless, yet each took its toll. Unwilling to bend, Danne scheduled a full press conference to release his internal audit data to the public. The night before, his shuttle exploded on its descent into Coruscant's atmosphere. The official investigation cited a navigation malfunction. Unofficially, no one believed the story. His files disappeared from Senate servers. His staff were reassigned or discharged. And within a week, the unmarked budget inquiry was declared closed due to lack of procedural continuity. The message was clear: power in the Senate was not to be challenged without cost. Truth, even when it flickered into view, was swiftly snuffed out. These hidden operations and silent maneuvers revealed the Senate's true nature. It was not a relic of noble ideals. It was a battlefield of shadows, where information wars replaced open conflict and where loyalty was monitored more closely than action. The intelligence arms of the Senate did not serve the Republic. They served the Senate itself, its preservation, its dominance, its legacy. Surveillance was not about defense. It was about knowing who to control. Black budgets were not about emergency preparedness. They were about ensuring that no project, no voice, no movement could grow without the Senate's blessing. And the removal of rogue actors was not a deviation. It was protocol. As the galaxy inched closer to civil war, these shadow games intensified. The line between secrecy and security vanished. Black projects expanded to include military cloning, propaganda testing, and Jedi profiling. Senators found themselves caught in a net of expectations and threats. Many unaware they were already compromised. The Senate continued to perform its rituals, the votes, the debates, the ceremonial addresses, but the soul of the institution had long since migrated to its shadow self. Decisions were made before the public ever heard the first motion. Allegiances were bought before any vote was cast. And the true power in the Republic lay not in the voices heard across the rotunda, but in the silences that followed them. Chapter 8: Diplomacy and Deception. For all the Senate's pretense of procedure and its endless committees, the heart of its power often beat beyond the chamber's walls. In the quiet negotiations of embassies, the tense atmosphere of planetary summits, and the soft, sharp edges of interplanetary diplomacy. To the average citizen, diplomacy was the art of peacekeeping, of forging agreements between cultures and systems too vast and varied to easily coexist. But in truth, it was a craft shaped more by deception than honesty, by carefully wielded pressure more than good faith. The Galactic Senate was never simply a lawmaking body. It was a diplomatic organism, its tendrils reaching into every government, corporate enclave, and rebel cell across the stars. And the senators themselves, far from being cloistered legislators, were often the Republic's chief diplomats, navigating the treacherous terrain of galactic politics not with treaties alone, but with leverage, manipulation, and the constant threat of abandonment or force. At its most visible, diplomacy took the form of crisis mediation and treaty brokering. When disputes flared between systems, over trade routes, territorial claims, or ideological schisms, the Senate dispatched teams of envoys to defuse the situation before it escalated into open conflict. These missions were often high-stakes affairs, conducted in neutral zones like the Alderaan Accords Pavilion or aboard orbiting stations such as the Abroa Sky Mediation Ring. The goal was always to reach an accord, to preserve the illusion that the Republic's reach extended not through coercion but through consensus. But the reality was far more complex. Senators acting as mediators were seldom neutral. They came bearing agendas crafted by their bloc alliances, their homeworld interests, or quiet promises made in backroom Senate offices. Their very presence in a negotiation was often a signal of pressure, the implication that failure to comply could lead to economic consequences or a withdrawal of Republic protection. These missions were less about resolving disputes and more about stabilizing profitable alliances, ensuring that the flow of goods, credits, and political influence remained unimpeded. Outside of crisis events, diplomacy functioned as an ongoing theater of influence. Senators maintained vast embassy networks, both on Coruscant and across key star systems. These embassies served not only as cultural liaisons, but as intelligence outposts, negotiation hubs, and economic leverage points. Envoy missions were dispatched regularly, small, mobile delegations that traveled to unstable regions under the guise of Republic goodwill. Their cargo holds were often filled with relief supplies, surveillance equipment, or untraceable grants to local governors. Such missions, celebrated in the HoloNet as gestures of peace, were in many cases subtle demands for allegiance. Entire planetary governments found themselves reshaped after such visits, as senators tied aid packages to voting support, as mining rights were traded for committee backing, and as diplomatic summits became vehicles for securing long-term political dominance. The Republic's flags flew high, but behind them were the quiet symbols of pressure: the favored banks, the contracted construction firms, the rewritten security codes. Not all diplomatic efforts succeeded, and the Senate's failures revealed much about the limits of its authority. The Corellian Treaty collapse was among the most notorious. Long viewed as a potential model for regional autonomy within the Republic, the Corellian government had pushed for a framework that would allow for independent foreign policy and trade negotiation, while remaining under the Senate's legislative umbrella. The treaty was painstakingly negotiated over 2 years, with multiple senators serving as mediators. But as the terms neared finalization, pressure from core world blocs, fearing the precedent such autonomy would set, torpedoed the effort. Trade clauses were stripped, mutual defense terms were watered down, and the language of sovereignty was replaced with legal ambiguity. Corellia, insulted and politically boxed in, withdrew. In the aftermath, civil unrest grew, and a subtle but enduring rift between Corellia and the Senate hardened. The treaty's failure was never officially acknowledged, but its consequences rippled outward, fueling separatist sentiment in other regions, disillusioning moderates, and demonstrating that Senate diplomacy had become a tool of containment rather than resolution. Even more visible was the diplomatic breakdown during the Naboo blockade. A conflict ostensibly about trade tariffs and shipping lanes, the blockade was, in truth, a test of the Republic's ability to respond to aggression masked as economic policy. The Trade Federation's encirclement of Naboo, with a fleet of battleships, was an act of war in all but name. The Senate's response was paralyzed, not by incompetence, but by entanglement. The Federation had bought too many votes, embedded itself too deeply in the Senate's economic framework. Debates dragged on for days, with senators bickering over procedural points while civilians on Naboo faced occupation and starvation. Envoys were dispatched only after extreme delays, and their arrival brought no resolution. It was only through the intervention of the Jedi, acting outside of Senate procedure, that the crisis was eventually exposed and addressed. But even then, the diplomatic damage was done. The Senate had proven that its loyalties could be bought, that its diplomacy was only as strong as its voting ledger. Naboo's humiliation was not just a planetary crisis, it was a galactic embarrassment, revealing the fragility of Senate negotiation when faced with a corporate power that understood the price of delay. This divergence between the Senate and the Jedi Order became increasingly prominent. While the Senate wielded diplomacy like a scalpel, with calculated aims and political leverage, the Jedi practiced it with a sense of moral duty and spiritual balance. Jedi ambassadors often operated with minimal Senate interference, relying on their instincts, their deep training in conflict resolution, and their reputation for impartiality. They mediated tribal wars on frontier worlds, resolved family feuds among noble houses, and de-escalated planetary standoffs with a word rather than a weapon. But this independence made them a liability to the Senate's political ambitions. Jedi negotiations frequently undermined the Republic's long-term leverage, securing peace at the cost of potential trade agreements or military footholds. Tensions simmered as Jedi success stories embarrassed senatorial mediators. Senate intelligence committees began monitoring Jedi deployments more closely. Memos circulated questioning the Jedi's loyalty. The relationship soured, slowly but irreversibly, as the Senate sought to reclaim its monopoly on diplomacy. Cooperation turned to conflict. Jedi envoys were quietly excluded from certain missions. Senators openly criticized Jedi mediation in budget hearings. The Guardians of Peace were being framed as political meddlers, not allies. Meanwhile, behind the curtain of official negotiations, another force exerted its own diplomatic will: the intergalactic banking clan. Though it claimed neutrality, the clan played both sides of every negotiation, offering financial packages, debt relief, or currency stabilization in exchange for concessions. Entire peace treaties were brokered with the understanding that the banking clan would fund reconstruction efforts or underwrite development bonds. Their representatives, often present at high-level summits, operated with complete immunity, shielded by their role as financial custodians of the Republic. Their influence was subtle, woven into every negotiation table. Planets too poor to afford prolonged disputes were quietly nudged toward compliance with the offer of low-interest loans. Diplomats seeking leverage were provided with discreet liquidity. Senators unable to pass legislation found alternative pathways through banking clan sponsorship. This fusion of finance and diplomacy hollowed out the Republic's capacity for genuine negotiation. Every peace was paid for. Every concession was calculated not in moral terms, but in compound interest. In time, war itself became diplomacy by other means. The Senate, paralyzed in dialogue and fractured by corruption, turned increasingly to military action as a final tool of negotiation. When peaceful mediation failed, by design or incompetence, blockades, occupations, and security interventions were authorized. Defense budgets ballooned. Naval patrols were repurposed as deterrents. The language of diplomacy remained, but its substance was replaced with strategy. The Republic justified these moves as necessary, pointing to threats from separatist factions, criminal syndicates, or unstable governments. But in truth, war had become a tool for maintaining galactic cohesion through fear. The message was clear. Compliance was rewarded with credits, protection, and prestige. Resistance was met with sanctions, military oversight, and the slow suffocation of planetary sovereignty. The Senate's diplomatic mission had begun centuries ago with hope, with the vision of a galaxy where words could prevent war, where diversity could coexist through dialogue. But as the Republic expanded and its interests hardened, that mission was corrupted. Treaties became contracts. Mediation became manipulation. The art of negotiation was no longer about mutual understanding. It was about advantage. Senators became emissaries of their sponsors. Peace was measured not by justice, but by profitability. And in the shadow of the Rotunda's great dome, diplomacy gave way to deception, until no one could remember where one ended and the other began. Chapter 9: Collapse of a Republic. The unraveling of the Galactic Republic was not a single moment of chaos or catastrophe, but rather a slow, grinding collapse marked by decades of corruption, complacency, and compromise. For centuries, the Republic had staggered under its own weight, burdened by layers of bureaucracy, corporate infiltration, and regional resentment. But it was the Naboo crisis that first tore the curtain away, revealing to the galaxy the extent of the Senate's paralysis. When the Trade Federation imposed a blockade on Naboo under the pretense of trade route protection, it exposed the dangerous truth that the Senate, once conceived as a vessel of peace and unity, had become an institution shackled by its own political entanglements. The Federation's actions, bold and illegal, should have prompted swift condemnation and intervention, but instead, debate fractured along party and bloc lines, and procedural stalling ensured that no motion of consequence could be passed. Chancellor Valorum, weakened by years of compromise and discredited by accusations of inaction, could do little but call for commissions and hope the Federation would back down. It was in this vacuum of will that a senator from the very planet under siege, Palpatine of Naboo, rose to prominence, presenting himself as the necessary alternative to an institution that had lost its ability to act. Palpatine understood the Senate better than anyone. He had spent years cultivating networks of influence among the mid-rim, the core worlds, and the corporate delegations. He knew how to speak in platitudes that masked ambition, how to offer calm in a storm that he had quietly helped create. After the crisis on Naboo revealed the Senate's inability to protect its own member systems, Valorum was ousted, and Palpatine ascended, not by seizing power, but by receiving it through the desperate votes of a body seeking stability at any cost. His chancellorship marked a turning point, an era where executive power would slowly consume legislative authority, masked always in the language of necessity. The Senate applauded him as a savior, unaware they were welcoming the slow death of their own relevance. The Republic had not yet fallen, but the gears had begun to turn. Palpatine's manipulation of Senate procedure was subtle at first. He invoked emergency powers not to dominate, but to accelerate relief. He created oversight committees that answered to his office, bypassing sluggish debates. He pushed through appointments of loyal bureaucrats, restructured the intelligence apparatus, and rewrote the rules of legislative engagement, all under the guise of reform. But the true consolidation of power came with the Military Creation Act, a proposal that would authorize the formation of a centralized, unified army under Republic command. For centuries, the Republic had relied on sector defense forces, Jedi intervention, and diplomacy to maintain peace. The idea of a standing army had long been rejected as a dangerous step toward authoritarianism. But as separatist sentiments grew, fueled by disillusionment in the Outer Rim and stoked by secret actors loyal to Palpatine, the Senate began to waver. Fear more than reason drove the change. The debate over the Military Creation Act was among the most contentious in Senate history. Senators argued for weeks. Some called for patience, others for preemptive strength. Behind closed doors, lobbying intensified. Intelligence briefings were manipulated. HoloNet stories warned of separatist invasions. The Kaminoan clone army, already commissioned in secret years before, hovered on the edge of revelation, waiting to be made official. And then, as if on cue, the Battle of Geonosis erupted, and the Jedi were drawn into open conflict. The army, once theoretical, was deployed overnight. The act was passed with overwhelming support, not because it was the will of the Senate, but because it had been engineered to appear inevitable. With the Grand Army now under his command, Chancellor Palpatine's transformation from elected leader to unassailable ruler began in earnest. There were those who resisted. Mon Mothma of Chandrila, idealistic and unyielding, spoke often of the Senate's responsibility to its people rather than its fears. She saw through the fog of emergency and warned of the creeping dissolution of democracy. Bail Organa, the noble and measured senator from Alderaan, worked tirelessly behind the scenes to maintain a coalition of moderates, advocating for transparency, accountability, and dialogue. His speeches in opposition to the more radical security measures were quiet but powerful, a voice of conscience in an increasingly panicked chamber. Padme Amidala, returned to the Senate after her time as Queen of Naboo, became a symbol of principled defiance. She warned again and again that the Republic was trading freedom for control, dignity for security, and law for convenience. Together, these senators tried to stem the tide through procedural maneuvers, public addresses, and secret meetings, but their efforts were no match for the machine that now drove the Senate forward. Palpatine played his adversaries masterfully. He painted resistance as weakness, opposition as disloyalty. He rallied public support through carefully orchestrated crises and used those moments to demand more power, always temporarily, always for the good of the Republic. The Senate, cowed by the weight of war and the fear of rebellion, conceded piece after piece of its authority. Each vote that expanded the Chancellor's powers was passed with the justification of expediency. Each erosion of legislative control was framed as a necessary sacrifice in the name of unity. But slowly, inexorably, the balance of power shifted. The Senate remained a spectacle, but no longer a source of governance. Senators still debated, still voted, still filled the airwaves with rhetoric, but the decisions were no longer theirs to make. The laws came from the Chancellor's office. The budgets were dictated, not negotiated. The armies marched on his word, not the Senate's approval. The final transformation came under the guise of victory. As the Clone Wars reached their zenith, and the Republic's forces pushed back the Separatist advance, Palpatine declared the need for final consolidation. The Jedi, long mistrusted and now framed as traitors in a masterstroke of propaganda, were purged. The few who remained were hunted or forced into hiding. With the Jedi gone, and the war drawing to a manufactured close, Palpatine summoned the Senate for an extraordinary session. The chamber was filled to capacity, delegates from every corner of the galaxy, weary from war, desperate for peace. He stood upon the central podium and spoke of betrayal, survival, and rebirth. The Jedi, he claimed, had sought to undermine the Republic. The war had shown that the Republic's structure was too weak to endure. It needed to evolve. It needed strength. With thunderous oratory, he proclaimed the reorganization of the Republic into the First Galactic Empire, a safe and secure society that would ensure peace and order. The chamber erupted in applause, not reluctant but wild, relieved, and unthinking. Senators who had once feared dictatorship now welcomed it as a cure for chaos. Those who had doubts stayed silent, calculating their futures in the new order. The final vote, a mere formality, passed with overwhelming support. The Senate, through its own hand, through fear and fatigue and the slow death of vigilance, ended itself. In name, it survived, but its soul, its power, its purpose, all of it had been surrendered in a moment of orchestrated triumph. What remained was a shell, a legislative pageant presided over by an emperor cloaked in legality. The Republic was no more, and in the echoes of that thunderous applause, democracy faded from the galaxy. Chapter 10: Echoes in the Empire and Beyond. When the thunder of applause faded in the Senate rotunda and the echo of Palpatine's declaration settled into history, what remained of the Galactic Senate was a hollow vessel, an ornate chamber filled not with power, but with the pretense of it. The Imperial Senate, as it came to be called, was a continuation in name only, a ceremonial body designed to project the illusion that governance persisted, that voices from the stars still mattered, that a galaxy now ruled by an emperor had not entirely forsaken its republican roots. But in truth, the Senate had been gutted. Its legislation became recommendation, its debates performative, its power neutered by the concentration of authority in the throne room of the Imperial Palace. The chamber remained intact, with its gleaming platforms and soaring architecture, but the soul that once imbued it, the messy, flawed, chaotic soul of democracy, had been banished. The Imperial Senate served a singular purpose: to validate the rule of one under the guise of continuity. For nearly 2 decades, the Senate continued its rituals. Senators filed their proposals, addressed their sectors, and debated toothlessly under the watchful eye of Imperial intelligence. Their positions were sustained not by constituent support or legislative value, but by their usefulness to the Emperor's broader machinery. Those who played their roles, who voted as instructed, supported Imperial programs, and quelled unrest in their regions, were rewarded with funding, security, and ceremonial authority. Those who stepped out of line, who raised questions, who hinted at the memory of the Republic, found themselves isolated, stripped of influence, or quietly removed. Surveillance within the Senate district reached unprecedented levels. Private conversations were recorded, aides were infiltrated, and loyalty was assessed not only through actions, but through associations and tone. The Senate had become a theater, one in which the actors knew their lines and feared to deviate. And yet, within this suffocating atmosphere, resistance flickered. Bail Organa of Alderaan, who had once stood firm in the waning days of the Republic, remained one of the few senators who understood that survival alone was not enough. He walked the line between obedience and opposition with careful precision, masking his contempt for the Empire beneath diplomatic pleasantries and strategic compliance. Behind the veil, he constructed a secret network, an interstellar web of sympathetic senators, planetary leaders, dissident officers, and idealistic youth. Using Senate channels, he moved information, people, and resources, cloaking his efforts in routine bureaucratic movements. His diplomatic vessels carried not only envoys, but encryption keys, data fragments, and hidden agents. Each committee hearing he attended, each Senate motion he seconded, served dual purposes, fulfilling his public duties while sending coded messages to those who still believed in freedom. The Senate, defanged though it was, provided cover. In the shadow of its rotunda, the seeds of rebellion were nurtured. Others joined him. Mon Mothma, having survived years of political tightrope walking, eventually broke publicly from the Senate with a declaration of rebellion that rang across the hollow net like a beacon. Her departure signaled the final crack in the illusion of representation. Senators had always been told that change could come from within, that reform was possible, that the Emperor tolerated their voices. But Mothma's message made clear what many had already suspected. The Senate was no longer a forum for peace, but a shield for oppression. In the years that followed, more senators defected, joining the growing rebel alliance or disappearing entirely. Some were hunted, others were silenced. But the rot had become visible, and the Emperor, ever aware of perception, recognized that the charade had outlived its usefulness. The formal dissolution of the Senate came swiftly, announced not with ceremony, but with a single decree. Palpatine, citing security concerns and the need for unified executive governance, disbanded the body entirely. Regional governors, already in de facto control of their sectors, were granted full authority. The voice of the people, however muted it had become, was extinguished. There were no votes, no objections. The Senate, having long since ceased to be a place of power, vanished with barely a whisper. The chamber was sealed. The offices emptied. Records were scrubbed. And across the galaxy, in the absence of even symbolic representation, despair deepened. Planets that had once held out hope for reform now faced the Empire's wrath without recourse. The mechanisms of diplomacy, already twisted, collapsed into irrelevance. And yet, history does not end with destruction. When the Empire fell at Ender, and the new Republic rose from its ashes, one of its first promises was the restoration of galactic representation. The new Republic Senate, convened on Chandrila at the insistence of Mon Mothma, sought to rebuild the dream that had been lost. The new government abandoned Coruscant, choosing instead to rotate the Senate's seat among various member worlds in an attempt to decentralize power. Representation was redrawn with equity in mind, giving voice to worlds long ignored. Corporate interests were curtailed, executive powers strictly limited. The early years were hopeful. Former rebels, scholars, and activists filled the chamber, determined to avoid the mistakes of the past. Treaties were ratified, war crimes were prosecuted, aid flowed to devastated regions, but the legacy of failure proved hard to escape. The scars left by centuries of Senate corruption, by the manipulation of trade routes, and by the betrayal of democratic ideals ran deep. Many systems distrusted the new republic as they had the old one. Others demanded autonomy, fearing that centralization would lead once again to tyranny. Disagreements over military readiness, regional policy, and economic planning fractured the Senate's unity. The Galactic Concordance, the peace treaty that ended the war with the remnants of the Empire, placed heavy restrictions on militarization, making the Republic appear weak in the eyes of many. Senators debated endlessly while new threats emerged. The First Order rose in the shadows, unchallenged by a republic that had tied its own hands. And when Hosnian Prime, the Republic's capital at the time, was destroyed by Starkiller Base, the Senate was obliterated once again, not by corruption, but by a sudden, overwhelming act of violence. The destruction of Hosnian Prime marked not only a strategic loss, but a symbolic one. The death of the Senate reaffirmed the galaxy's deepest cynicism, that representative government was fragile, easily corrupted, and ultimately powerless. The lesson, carved into the history of two republics, was brutal. Good intentions could not protect against tyranny. Procedure could not replace principle, and ceremony could not substitute for action. The very structure of representation, its committees, votes, motions, and alliances, had become a vulnerability, exploited first by Palpatine and later by inertia. Democracy had proven incapable of defending itself from the inside. It had relied on the assumption of good faith, on the restraint of power, on the wisdom of institutions. And in each case, those assumptions had failed. Yet not all lessons are final. Even as the galaxy reeled from tragedy, resistance endured. The principles that had once guided the Republic, liberty, dialogue, cooperation, found new life in the grassroots, in the scattered survivors of the new Republic, in the daring leaders of the resistance, and in the hearts of beings who still believed that their voices mattered. The Senate had collapsed twice, but the idea behind it had not died. In remote systems, small councils formed, eager to preserve the traditions of debate and representation. In shattered colonies, teachers told stories of Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, and Padme Amidala. And in secret hideouts, those hunted by the First Order passed encoded messages, holding tightly to the idea that the people could rule themselves. The Galactic Senate, in its grandeur and failure, remains a testament to both the nobility and the frailty of democracy. It stood for 1,000 years, shaping laws, mediating peace, and bearing witness to the hopes of countless worlds. But it also became a machine of stagnation, a vessel for corruption, and a gateway to dictatorship. Its fall reminds the galaxy that governance is not guaranteed, that representation is not self-sustaining, and that vigilance must be eternal. The Republic, in every form it has taken, was a mirror of the galaxy it served. When that galaxy surrendered to fear, the Senate became a stage for tyranny. When it rose again with courage, the dream returned. The lesson, etched into the stones of a broken rotunda, is simple and eternal. Freedom must be defended not with applause, but with action. And the voice of the stars must never again be taken for granted.